The morning sun slanted through the tall, narrow windows of the small-town courtroom, painting the worn wooden benches with warm streaks of gold. It was a place built for seriousness, where every creak of the floorboards, every shuffle of papers, carried the weight of law and order. Usually the courtroom hummed with monotony. Lawyers in stiff suits, the occasional muttered objection, the soft, rhythmic tapping of the judge's gavel. But today, the courtroom felt different, charged with a subtle undercurrent of anticipation, the kind that precedes something unexpected. At the center of this unusual scene sat a 3-year-old child, perched nervously on her mother's lap. Tiny fingers clutched the edge of a small jacket, and wide, curious eyes scanned the room, taking in faces lined with stern expressions. The child's gaze lingered on the polished wooden podium where the judge sat, on the rows of benches filled with adult spectators, and finally on the sleek black and tan figure standing attentively beside a police officer. Max, the K-9 officer. Max was a German shepherd, lean and powerful, with eyes that gleamed with intelligence and training. His coat shimmered under the fluorescent lights, and his ears twitched at the faintest sounds. He was not just a dog, he was a professional, trained in narcotics detection, crowd control, and protection. He had been to crime scenes, sniffed out danger, and served his community with unwavering discipline. Yet today, he would meet a visitor unlike any other, a tiny human whose size belied the courage she was about to display. The spectators whispered quietly among themselves. "Why is a toddler here?" one person muttered. "Do you think she even knows what's happening?" asked another, more concerned. The lawyers exchanged brief, puzzled glances, while the judge, an older man with a reputation for patience and fairness, tapped his gavel lightly, waiting for proceedings to begin. It wasn't common to see children in court, let alone one so small addressing a trained police dog in the center of a legal arena. The child's mother gave her daughter a reassuring smile. "It's okay, honey," she whispered. "Just be yourself." The child nodded slightly, though it was clear she didn't fully understand why she was here. All she knew was that the dog beside the officer looked large, imposing, and somehow fascinating. Her tiny heart thumped with a mix of fear and excitement. She had met dogs before, fluffy, playful companions at parks or in neighbors' yards, but Max was different. He was serious, professional, and utterly majestic in his composure. As the courtroom settled, the K-9 officer knelt beside Max and gave a subtle command. The dog's ears pricked, and his gaze followed the officer's fingers. Despite his training, there was an almost imperceptible flicker of curiosity in Max's eyes as they landed on the toddler. It was as if he sensed something special, something that transcended the formalities of law enforcement. The officer smiled knowingly, aware that Max had a gentle side that often went unnoticed by adults, who saw only the dog's capabilities in service. The room's atmosphere began to shift, imperceptibly at first. The adults leaned back slightly in their seats, a little uncertain. Even the judge, who had seen countless courtroom dramas unfold, allowed himself a subtle smile. There was something in the air that suggested this would not be an ordinary day. Whispers softened, and eyes kept drifting toward the little girl, who now clutched the edge of her mother's jacket a little tighter. Then, as if guided by instinct, the child wiggled out of her mother's embrace. Her little legs, short and wobbly, carried her toward the front of the courtroom. Each step was tentative yet determined. The polished floor reflected her tiny shoes, and the adults watched in silence, mesmerized. She stopped a few feet away from Max and looked up at him with eyes wide open, filled with the innocence only a child could hold. For a moment, the courtroom was suspended in stillness. "Hi, doggy," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was simple, yet it carried a purity that made the room collectively hold its breath. Max's ears flicked, and he tilted his head slightly, as if listening carefully to understand every word. The child's small hand reached out, trembling just slightly, toward his nose. The officer held his breath, ready to intervene if needed, but Max remained perfectly still, attentive and calm. The spectators' expressions softened. Some smiled, others chuckled quietly, but all felt a tug at their hearts. It was rare to see such bravery in someone so tiny, and rarer still to see the meeting of innocence and trained instinct unfold so naturally. Even the judge, who had presided over countless contentious cases, leaned slightly forward in his chair, intrigued by this unexpected spectacle. The courtroom, once filled with tension and solemnity, now radiated warmth and gentle anticipation. The child whispered again, her words barely audible but unmistakably earnest. "You're a good boy, Max, don't be scared." Her hand inched closer and the dog's nose twitched. Max exhaled softly, the faintest wag of his tail signaling that he had accepted her presence. It was a quiet, almost sacred moment, a bridge between worlds. The trained law enforcement dog and the tiny human were communicating without words, through gestures, trust, and simple heart. The mother stood quietly behind her daughter, eyes misty but proud. She knew that this encounter would be remembered not just by those present in the courtroom, but potentially far beyond. Something special had happened here, a reminder that even in the most structured, serious environments, innocence and courage could create a moment of connection that transcended expectation. Whispers traveled through the courtroom again, this time tinged with admiration rather than curiosity. The lawyers shifted in their seats, the spectators leaned in slightly, and even the judge's stern expression softened into something almost human, almost tender. A 3-year-old had turned a formal courtroom into a space where hearts spoke louder than words, and trust could be felt in the quiet interaction between child and dog. For a few minutes, time seemed to stretch. The polished floors, the high ceilings, the rows of benches, all of it faded into the background. The focus was entirely on the tiny girl and the majestic German shepherd. Each movement mattered. The tilt of Max's head, the gentle stretch of the child's hand, the subtle wag of a tail. It was as if the universe had paused to watch, granting the audience an unscripted performance that no one could have predicted. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of quiet, the child's voice rose a little clear and confident now. "Don't worry, Max, I'm your friend." The words, simple yet profound, resonated through the room. The officer exhaled slowly, impressed at the bond forming before his eyes. Max nudged the child gently with his nose, a gesture of acknowledgement, trust, and perhaps even friendship. It was the kind of interaction that adults often sought but rarely experienced, a pure, mutual connection untainted by expectation. And in that small courtroom, the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary. A 3-year-old had approached a trained police dog, bridging the gap between human innocence and professional duty. The room, which had begun the day with muted tension and whispered questions, now brimmed with a quiet awe. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something remarkable, a fleeting but unforgettable reminder of the power of trust, courage, and heart. The courtroom remained unusually quiet, the earlier whispers settling into a stillness filled with anticipation. All eyes stayed on the tiny figure standing near the front, her fingers brushing Max's sleek fur. The German shepherd, trained for high-pressure situations, seemed almost human in his calm attentiveness. He had been through traffic stops, raids, and tense encounters, yet nothing had prepared him for this. His amber eyes followed every movement of the child, head tilted slightly, ears alert but not threatening. Even the K-9 officer, who had worked with Max for years, couldn't suppress a small smile of awe. Max was a veteran of the force. His work had saved lives, discovered hidden contraband, and prevented dangerous situations from escalating. Yet in the polished wood of this courtroom, he had no authority to enforce laws, no need to intimidate or guard. Here, he was simply a presence, a living, breathing partner to the officer beside him. But it was clear to everyone watching that Max was aware of the delicate nature of the encounter unfolding before him. The energy in the room shifted subtly, from curiosity to suspense, and finally to gentle warmth. The toddler took another careful step closer, her small shoes clicking faintly on the polished floor. She held her hand out, hesitated, then whispered, "I like you, Max, you're nice." Her voice was soft, untrained, filled with the unfiltered honesty that only a child could possess. Adults in the courtroom leaned forward slightly, captivated. Some could barely contain their smiles, others were on the verge of tears. The child's confidence, tiny yet resolute, drew a stark contrast to the imposing presence of the professional canine. Max responded as if he understood every word. His tail gave a slow, controlled wag, a gesture that was subtle but unmistakable. The officer relaxed slightly, giving the dog the freedom to interact naturally. Max in this moment was more than a police dog. He was a listener, a gentle giant accepting the trust extended by someone far smaller than himself. The child, encouraged, reached out and gently touched Max's head. The audience collectively exhaled, as though everyone in the room had been holding their breath. The judge, a man accustomed to courtroom decorum and rigid procedures, shifted slightly in his chair. His gavel rested idle on the bench, forgotten for the first time that morning. He had presided over years of serious cases, from domestic disputes to complex legal battles, and he had seen countless demonstrations of power and authority. Yet none of that seemed to matter now. In front of him, a 3-year-old and a trained K-9 officer were quietly rewriting the rules of connection and trust. It was a small miracle unfolding in real time. The spectators were not immune to the emotional gravity of the moment. Lawyers lowered their pens, secretaries paused mid-note, and visitors leaned forward, unsure whether to speak or simply observe. The room's usual hum of legal procedure had been replaced by a kind of shared reverence. It wasn't just the child's courage that was remarkable. It was the way Max met her presence with calm attentiveness. The connection was almost tactile, something the audience could feel in their chests rather than just see. The child's mother, standing slightly behind her daughter, whispered encouragements, careful not to disrupt the delicate atmosphere. "It's okay, sweetie. Just talk to him like you do with your toys." The child nodded, eyes bright with determination, and took a deep breath. "Max," she said softly, "you're my friend, okay? I like you." Her tiny hand stroked his fur once more. Max tilted his head, letting out the faintest exhale of air, a sound almost like acknowledgement. It was enough. The K-9 officer watched in quiet amazement. Max had been trained to obey commands, to remain vigilant in stressful situations, to discern threats instantly. Yet now, without any verbal command, the dog was demonstrating patience, gentleness, and understanding. It was as if he knew instinctively that the child posed no danger, that her approach was sincere, and that her tiny hands were an offering of friendship rather than a test of authority. The officer felt a swell of pride, both for Max and for the extraordinary courage of a child so small. As the audience continued to watch, the child's confidence grew. She began to speak more openly, telling Max about her favorite toys, about a story she had read the night before, and even about her pet cat at home. The words spilled out in a stream of innocent chatter, unfiltered and heartfelt. Max remained perfectly still, head tilting occasionally, ears twitching to catch every sound. The courtroom, once tense with expectation, now buzzed with an energy that was soft, human, and heartwarming. The judge leaned forward slightly, curiosity overtaking protocol. "Well," he murmured, mostly to himself, "that's not something I see every day." Even he could feel the subtle lesson unfolding. Courage isn't measured by size, and connection isn't constrained by position or authority. In that room, the child and the dog were equals in a way that defied the normal hierarchy of law and procedure. The judge's stern gaze softened, his mind momentarily freed from the rigidity of legal text. Other spectators began to respond quietly. A few chuckled softly at the child's frank observations. Others exchanged nods, acknowledging the silent lesson unfolding. Bravery, trust, and empathy could come from unexpected places. The court reporter, discreetly capturing notes, glanced at her camera, knowing she had witnessed a story worth sharing. The child's words, though simple, were weaving a narrative that would resonate beyond these walls. A story about innocence meeting responsibility, curiosity meeting discipline, and heart meeting duty. The child paused, resting her small hands on Max's strong shoulders, looking up at him with complete trust. "I won't hurt you, Max," she said earnestly. "I just want to be your friend." Max's response was subtle, a slow wag of the tail, a slight nuzzle, but it was enough to confirm the bond forming between them. The audience could feel the shift. The tension of the courtroom dissolved entirely, replaced by a shared sense of awe. For a few moments, law and order faded, leaving room only for trust, courage, and connection. The mother smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. She had brought her daughter here for reasons unrelated to spectacle, yet she now realized that her child had created a moment that would not be forgotten. This was no longer just a courtroom procedure. It was a lesson in humanity. The tiny child had approached a trained police dog, bridging worlds that rarely intersected with such grace. It was a moment that transcended expectations and captured something universal, the power of innocence to touch hearts. Max, for his part, seemed to understand instinctively. He had been trained to protect, to detect, and to respond. But in this courtroom, protection was no longer about guarding against danger. It was about meeting trust with gentleness. The K-9 officer allowed Max the freedom to interact naturally, watching in quiet wonder as his partner displayed patience and empathy that could not be taught in training manuals. For a brief, shining moment, child and dog were equals, connected in a silent conversation of gestures and understanding. And so the first encounter ended, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet acknowledgement, a soft wag of a tail, and a child's satisfied smile. The courtroom slowly returned to its usual rhythm, yet everyone present carried the memory of what had occurred. Lawyers straightened their notes, spectators resumed their seated positions, and the judge prepared to continue proceedings. But beneath the surface, a subtle change had occurred. The ordinary room, meant for rules and procedures, had become a place where the heart spoke louder than words. The story of a 3-year-old and a police dog had begun, quietly, but it would not end here. It had planted a seed of awe, of wonder, and of connection in every witness. And even as the day's proceedings moved forward, the memory of this unexpected, gentle encounter lingered, reminding everyone that courage and compassion often come in the smallest forms, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons are delivered by the tiniest voices. The room had grown impossibly quiet, a hush that seemed to hold even the faintest breath. Every eye followed the small, determined figure of the 3-year-old as she took a tentative step closer to Max, the police dog, her tiny fingers stretched in cautious curiosity. The polished courtroom floor reflected her shoes and her shadow, both small yet commanding in their ability to draw attention. For the first time that morning, the spectators weren't focused on law or procedure. They were captivated by the bond forming between an innocent child and a trained K-9 officer. The child's mother watched nervously from behind, clutching the edge of her coat. Her heart thumped in anticipation, equal parts worry and pride. "Be gentle, honey," she whispered under her breath. The toddler nodded, but it was clear that instructions alone could not prepare anyone for what was about to happen. This wasn't a performance, a staged interaction, or a simple photo opportunity. It was the unfolding of something organic, something so rare it demanded full attention. The first genuine, direct communication between the child and Max. Taking a deep breath, the child's small lips parted. "Hi, doggy," she said, her voice almost trembling but carrying a distinct clarity. It wasn't the voice of someone trying to impress. It was the voice of someone speaking purely from the heart. The words, simple and unadorned, seemed to resonate through the high-ceilinged courtroom. For a moment, the murmurs of the spectators ceased entirely. Lawyers lowered their pens, and even the judge leaned forward, curiosity overtaking the usual rigid formality. A 3-year-old had captured attention in a space dominated by adults, authority, and the weight of law. Max responded in the only way he could, by tilting his head slightly, ears pricked, eyes locked on the child. There was a subtle exhalation, almost imperceptible, and a gentle shift of weight that indicated awareness and attentiveness. The K-9 officer glanced down at Max, barely suppressing a smile of admiration. Years of training and countless deployments had prepared Max for tense encounters, for danger and unpredictability, but this was different. Here, he had no orders, no threats to assess. Instead, he faced the innocence and honesty of a child, and he met her with quiet understanding. Encouraged, the child took another step forward, her fingers brushing lightly against Max's head. "You're a good boy," she whispered. Her words, soft as they were, carried a weight that stunned the room. The audience could feel the gentle authority of her sincerity. Even adults, accustomed to hierarchy, felt the moment's unusual power. A lawyer on the side adjusted his glasses, unable to look away. A clerk dabbed at the corner of her eye, realizing that she was witnessing something far more profound than the usual courtroom proceedings. The child's confidence grew with every word. "I like you, Max. I'm your friend," she added, her tiny hand stroking the fur carefully, almost reverently. Max leaned slightly into the gesture, his eyes calm but alert, his body language conveying an unexpected warmth. The K-9 officer felt a lump in his throat. Years of discipline and rigorous training couldn't have prepared him for this. A child teaching an experienced police dog about trust, using nothing but sincerity and innocence. The courtroom, a place of rules, was suddenly a theater of empathy. The judge, who had spent decades enforcing order and overseeing serious matters, allowed himself a small, rare smile. His gavel rested idle, forgotten as he observed the tender interaction. He had seen countless cases of conflict, tension, and legal maneuvering, but he had never witnessed courage so unguarded, nor connection so pure. The child's tiny voice, coupled with Max's calm response, had softened the courtroom in a way that no procedural rule could dictate. It was a reminder that some lessons cannot be taught, they must simply be experienced. Spectators whispered quietly, their previous curiosity now transformed into awe. "She's fearless," one murmured. "And he's listening," said another. The courtroom clerk, a woman usually reserved and precise, let out a soft, amazed laugh. The energy in the room shifted entirely. The formal atmosphere that had dominated the morning became secondary to the story unfolding at the front. Everyone present, whether intentionally or not, became part of the silent narrative, a witness to a bond that transcended age, species, and expectation. The child crouched slightly to meet Max's gaze, her hand still resting lightly on his shoulders. "Don't be scared," she whispered. "I won't hurt you, I just want to be your friend." Her tone was earnest, almost pleading in its gentle insistence. Max's response was subtle but unmistakable, a slight nuzzle, a soft wag of the tail. The gesture communicated trust, acceptance, and the unspoken understanding that friendship had been extended and accepted. The audience could feel the gravity of the moment. A courtroom full of adults watching a dialogue of hearts rather than laws. The K-9 officer, standing a step behind, allowed himself a rare moment of admiration. Max had always been disciplined, obedient, and alert, but here he demonstrated patience and empathy that could not be commanded. It was instinctive, intuitive, almost human in its subtlety. For a child, Max was not an enforcer, nor a symbol of authority. He was simply a companion, a listener, a friend. And for everyone in the courtroom, the sight was mesmerizing, almost magical. Encouraged by Max's calm presence, the child began to speak more openly. She described her favorite toys, her bedtime stories, even the antics of her family cat. Her words were simple, unfiltered, and full of wonder. Each sentence seemed to invite Max further into her world, and each gesture of trust elicited a gentle response from him. The courtroom spectators found themselves leaning in, captivated by a story that unfolded without a single script. The moment transcended law and procedure, replacing it with empathy, innocence, and quiet awe. The judge leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, unable to hide his fascination. "Remarkable," he murmured under his breath. "Absolutely remarkable." Even he, trained to remain impartial and detached, felt the emotional pull of the encounter. There was no need for commentary, no need for legal analysis. The bond between child and dog spoke louder than any argument, louder than any gavel, louder than any procedure. For a brief shining moment, the courtroom became a stage for something far greater than law, humanity itself. The audience's reactions varied but were unanimous in sentiment. Some smiled openly, tears threatening the corners of their eyes. Others simply watched in silence, unable to look away from a display of courage, innocence, and trust that defied explanation. Lawyers abandoned their notes. Clerks paused mid-typing. Even reporters quietly set down their pens, realizing they were witnessing a story worth remembering, not for its legal significance but for its heart. A 3-year-old and a police dog were teaching an audience more about bravery and empathy than any law book ever could. The child's mother whispered softly to herself, barely audible over the silence, "She's incredible." And indeed, the toddler's bravery was inspiring. Here was a child, barely out of infancy, speaking confidently to a fully grown, highly trained dog in front of dozens of adults. She had stepped beyond fear, beyond hesitation, and met Max with honesty and courage. And in return, Max had responded, not as a tool of law enforcement, but as a living, breathing companion willing to accept trust and offer friendship. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, though in reality only a handful of moments had passed. Every gesture mattered. The slight tilt of Max's head, the gentle reach of the child's hand, the softening of adults' expressions. The courtroom, which had begun the morning in rigid order, had transformed into a place of connection, trust, and wonder. Here, the audience experienced something rare and unrepeatable, a demonstration of courage and empathy, simple yet profound, from the most unexpected teacher and student. Finally, after a quiet pause, the child straightened, a small, satisfied smile on her face. "See, Max, I'm your friend," she said, her voice brimming with innocent triumph. Max responded with a gentle nudge, a silent confirmation that their connection was real, mutual, and enduring. The K-9 officer allowed a small exhale, proud of both the dog's behavior and the child's courage. The courtroom, silent but fully present, absorbed the finality of the moment, knowing they had all witnessed something extraordinary. Even as proceedings began to resume, the first words exchanged between the child and Max lingered in the air. The courtroom had shifted, not in law, not in procedure, but in spirit. Every witness, clerk, lawyer, and judge carried the memory of a tiny voice meeting a trained, disciplined animal in mutual trust. The child had spoken first, not just to a dog, but to the room itself, reminding everyone that courage, connection, and empathy could be found in the most unexpected places. The courtroom remained suspended in a quiet, almost reverent stillness. Every eye was fixed on the unfolding scene, a 3-year-old child standing mere inches from Max, the police dog, whose usual disciplined demeanor softened in the presence of innocence. The child's small fingers rested gently on Max's head, stroking along the coarse fur with tentative confidence. Max, who had faced dangerous criminals, tight corners, and tense standoffs, now seemed fully engaged in a dialogue without words. His eyes, alert yet gentle, met hers as though acknowledging the sincerity of her tiny, trembling voice. For the first time that morning, the audience felt a tangible shift. The weight of routine, the gravity of legal proceedings, and the invisible pressure of authority were replaced by something more elemental: trust. The child's simple gestures, stroking Max's ears, whispering encouragement, were answered not in commands or obedience, but in subtle cues of connection. Max leaned forward slightly, a low exhale escaping his muzzle, his tail giving a careful, measured wag. The K-9 officer, trained to notice even the smallest behavioral signals, recognized it immediately. Max was responding not out of duty, but empathy. The child's confidence grew with each interaction. "See, Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible yet perfectly clear in the hushed room. "I'm your friend, you don't have to be scared." Her tiny hand stroked the dog's back gently, moving slowly, deliberately. The audience, initially captivated by curiosity, now felt a wave of emotional warmth. Even the judge, accustomed to authority and procedure, leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the bench. He had presided over countless courtroom dramas, but he had never witnessed courage or connection like this. Max shifted slightly, his ears flicking in acknowledgement. He leaned closer, careful not to overpower the child's small frame, and offered the faintest nuzzle. It was a small, quiet gesture, almost imperceptible, but for those watching, it was monumental. In that moment, the child's courage and trust had been fully accepted, and the dog's response communicated a mutual understanding. The courtroom audience, sensing the rarity of the moment, remained silent, absorbing every subtle detail. The tilt of Max's head, the soft exhalation from his nostrils, the slight wag of his tail. The child continued, emboldened by the dog's gentle response. "I like you, Max. You're brave and I'm brave too," she added, her words small yet powerful. Each syllable resonated through the room, carrying an innocence that struck every adult present. There were no arguments, no objections, no legal maneuvers, just the raw honesty of a child and the unspoken acknowledgement of a trained professional animal. The courtroom, designed for rules and order, had become a theater of trust, courage, and human connection. The K-9 officer allowed himself a rare, proud smile. He had worked with Max for years, training him for tense encounters, dangerous searches, and life-or-death situations. But even his extensive experience could not replicate what was happening now. Max, disciplined and alert for all emergencies, had chosen in that instant to meet the child with calmness, empathy, and patience. It was instinctive, natural, and profoundly moving. He was not responding to commands. He was responding to sincerity, to courage, to trust. Spectators began to soften visibly. Lawyers relaxed in their seats, spectators leaned forward, and a few even whispered quietly, marveling at the connection. The courtroom clerk, usually precise and detached, dabbed at the corner of her eye, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of the interaction. The judge, who prided himself on impartiality, found his heart tugged in ways he had not anticipated. He realized that this small encounter was more than a brief distraction. It was a lesson in empathy, trust, and the unexpected ways courage manifests. Encouraged by Max's subtle responses, the child spoke more openly, sharing stories and observations in her small, melodic voice. She told him about her favorite stuffed animal, about her family's cat, and even about a recent trip to the park where she had learned to swing higher than ever before. Max listened, tilting his head, his breathing steady and calm, occasionally giving a slight nudge as if affirming her bravery and sincerity. It was a silent conversation that transcended the limitations of language, connecting two beings through trust and attention. The audience was spellbound. No one spoke, yet every observer felt the weight of the moment. The courtroom, a place usually filled with formality and strict procedure, had transformed into a space of genuine human experience. Adults were reminded of the courage it takes to trust, and the beauty of innocence that can elicit empathy even from the most disciplined and trained animals. The child had become a teacher in her own right, instructing everyone present on the unspoken language of heart and trust. The judge, leaning slightly forward in his chair, couldn't help but quietly remark, "This is extraordinary." His voice was low, almost to himself, but audible enough for nearby spectators to hear. In that instant, the solemnity of the courtroom was softened by shared recognition of something rare and human. A 3-year-old had entered a professional, structured space and reminded adults of courage, trust, and the pure joy of connection. Max had responded with gentle acknowledgement, making the encounter unforgettable for all present. The child's mother watched, her eyes shimmering with pride and a touch of awe. She realized her daughter had done more than approach a dog. She had touched hearts, created a moment of empathy, and inspired everyone in the room. Her tiny voice, paired with Max's calm presence, had turned an ordinary courtroom morning into a lesson in courage, trust, and kindness. Even years of experience could not replicate what had been accomplished in these few quiet moments. Max, sensing the child's confidence, inched slightly closer, careful not to overwhelm her small frame. He lowered his head slightly, pressing his muzzle gently against her shoulder, a silent gesture of friendship and trust. The audience gasped softly, some blinking rapidly to hold back tears. It was a simple act, but in it lay profound meaning, that empathy, courage, and connection could transcend even the most rigid boundaries. The child had spoken first, but Max had answered in a language older than words: loyalty, trust, and gentle acknowledgement. Encouraged by the dog's response, the child giggled softly, her voice ringing like a bell through the courtroom. "See, Max, we can be friends," she exclaimed. Her hands moved confidently across his fur, affirming her words with tactile sincerity. Max's tail gave a slow, deliberate wag, his ears remaining alert but unthreatened. The K-9 officer, watching intently, knew that these moments were precious and rare, the kind of experiences that could stay with a police dog and his partner for years. The courtroom, which had begun as a place of rigid order, had become a theater of trust. Spectators whispered among themselves, captivated not by legal arguments but by the quiet exchange unfolding before them. Lawyers paused, pens held midair, clerks glanced up from keyboards, and the judge leaned back slightly, taking it all in. The connection between a small child and a highly trained dog had shifted something subtle but powerful in everyone present, a reminder of humanity's capacity for empathy and the courage it takes to open one's heart. As the minutes passed, the child continued to speak softly, narrating little stories about her world. Max remained patient, attentive, and gentle, giving the child a safe space to express herself. It was a dialogue without words, a shared moment of understanding, and a profound reminder that courage comes in many forms, even in the voice of a 3-year-old speaking directly to a powerful, disciplined police dog. Finally, the child straightened, satisfied with the response she had received. She patted Max gently one last time and smiled broadly. "We're friends now, Max," she said. Max responded with a gentle nuzzle and a slow, deliberate wag of his tail. The audience exhaled, some softly clapping, though most remained in quiet awe. What had begun as a simple approach had grown into a profound, unforgettable encounter that would be remembered by all who witnessed it. And so the morning continued, but the impact of that gentle interaction lingered. The courtroom had witnessed more than a child and a dog. It had seen courage, trust, and empathy in its purest forms. Adults were reminded that bravery isn't always loud, that authority can coexist with gentleness, and that connections, even between the most unlikely beings, can change hearts forever. In that courtroom, Max and the child had spoken a language that transcended words, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. The courtroom, once dominated by the steady rhythm of official proceedings, now vibrated with a different energy, one of warmth, curiosity, and quiet awe. The 3-year-old, standing a few feet from Max, seemed oblivious to the formalities of the room. Her small hands continued to move gently across the police dog's fur, her words soft, sincere, and surprisingly confident. "You're brave, Max," she whispered, "and I'm brave too." Each syllable carried more weight than any legal argument ever could. The audience could feel it in their chests, a rare, unspoken lesson in courage and trust. Adults exchanged glances. Lawyers leaned back, pens idle in midair. Clerks paused mid-note, eyes wide with disbelief and delight. Even the judge, who had seen the gravest of courtroom moments, allowed himself a gentle, almost imperceptible smile. It was the kind of moment that defied categorization, neither formal nor casual, neither trivial nor monumental, yet somehow profoundly affecting. A tiny child and a fully trained, disciplined dog were quietly teaching the room a lesson in empathy, patience, and the simple power of connection. Max remained calm, his tail giving a measured wag in response to the child's gentle words. His ears flicked at each sound, his eyes following the child's every movement. He had faced tense encounters, dangerous situations, and unpredictable behavior countless times, but here he showed a different kind of awareness. No commands were necessary. No corrections, no alerts, just trust. The K-9 officer, observing closely, could only marvel at how naturally Max met the child's innocence with subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement. The child's confidence grew with each passing second. She began to speak more openly, narrating little details of her day, sharing stories about her favorite toys, her bedtime routine, and even about her small adventures in the park. Max listened, tilting his head at intervals, nudging her slightly when she reached for him. The audience, absorbed in the interaction, couldn't help but smile. What was supposed to be a routine courtroom session had transformed into a gentle theater of emotion, vulnerability, and unexpected bravery. A soft murmur ran through the spectators. Some whispered words of admiration, others exchanged quiet nods of approval. Even the judge, who prided himself on impartiality and formality, could not hide the effect of the scene before him. "Remarkable," he murmured under his breath. His gavel rested untouched as he leaned slightly forward, captivated by the unexpected display of innocence, courage, and mutual trust. It was a moment that reminded everyone present that empathy and kindness could transcend age, training, and circumstance. The child's mother stood a few steps behind, her eyes glimmering with pride and emotion. She had brought her daughter to the courtroom for practical reasons, not anticipating that her little one would create a memory that would resonate with everyone present. Seeing her child interact fearlessly with Max, she felt a mixture of amazement, pride, and a profound sense of awe. Her daughter, barely out of toddlerhood, had captivated the room, drawing out warmth and compassion from even the sternest adults. As the minutes passed, the audience's reactions intensified. Some visitors dabbed at their eyes, quietly fighting tears. A few discreetly smiled, unable to conceal their admiration for the child's bravery. Lawyers set aside their documents, captivated by the sheer purity of the moment. Even court staff, who had witnessed countless proceedings, seemed mesmerized. The courtroom had become a living example of trust, courage, and the power of small gestures. It was impossible not to be touched. Child, sensing the acceptance and gentle response from Max, grew bolder. "You're my friend, Max. You can trust me," she whispered, her tiny fingers brushing the dog's ears. Max responded with a subtle nuzzle, leaning slightly into her touch. The K-9 officer's chest swelled with pride. He had trained Max for years, but never had he witnessed a connection so deep, so instant, and so emotionally profound. This wasn't training, it was understanding, instinct, and a bond that transcended species. Spectators watched, captivated, as the child's confidence blossomed. She began to tell Max little stories, laughing softly at her own words, describing her favorite bedtime routines, her toys, and even her family's cat. Max remained attentive, tilting his head, giving small, subtle gestures of acknowledgement. It was a silent conversation, a dialogue of trust and shared understanding that required no translation. The room seemed to collectively exhale, absorbed in the quiet beauty of the moment. The judge, leaning slightly forward, allowed himself a rare smile. His gavel remained idle as he absorbed the scene. For years, he had presided over tense arguments, emotional testimonies, and conflicts that tested patience and empathy. Yet nothing had compared to this. A child, 3 years old, engaging with a police dog in a demonstration of courage and trust that had captured the hearts of every adult present. It was a quiet, profound lesson. Sometimes the smallest voices teach the most important truths. The courtroom murmurs softened into quiet awe. Lawyers whispered gently among themselves, reflecting on the unusual display of bravery and trust. Clerks paused mid-task, captivated by the child's fearless engagement. Even spectators who had entered simply for curiosity found themselves transformed, witness to a scene that would linger in memory. A tiny voice, unafraid and full of sincerity, had elicited gentleness from a disciplined, powerful creature trained for vigilance and authority. It was a reminder of the power of connection and empathy, no matter one's size or experience. The child's mother, her heart full, whispered quietly to herself. "You're amazing, my little one," she said, tears welling in her eyes. Her daughter's courage and honesty had reached far beyond what she had imagined possible. She had approached a dog trained for the most demanding duties and without fear earned his trust. The bond that had formed in the span of minutes transcended expectation, leaving an impression on everyone present. It was not just a fleeting moment, it was a memory that would endure. Max, sensing the child's bravery and sincerity, leaned forward slightly, his head brushing gently against her shoulder. The subtle nuzzle communicated more than words ever could. It spoke of trust, recognition, and acceptance. The audience, recognizing the significance of this gesture, was silent for a long moment, fully absorbed in the scene. The child had offered courage and friendship. Max had responded in kind. Together, they had created a story of innocence, trust, and empathy that would be remembered far beyond the courtroom walls. Encouraged by Max's subtle, gentle response, the child smiled brightly. "See, Max, we can be friends forever," she whispered, her tone filled with innocent conviction. Max responded with another gentle nudge, tail wagging slowly, ears alert but relaxed. The K-9 officer allowed himself a moment of pride and quiet awe. He knew that these moments were rare, extraordinary, and unforgettable. It was more than training, it was connection, courage, and heart-meeting instinct. The courtroom audience, moved by the unfolding scene, could not contain their admiration. Some clapped softly, though most remained silent, captivated by the intimate, extraordinary interaction. The judge, leaning back, allowed a gentle smile to spread across his face. What had begun as a routine morning in court had become a showcase of innocence, bravery, and the quiet, transformative power of trust. The tiny child and the disciplined police dog had taught the adults a lesson they would not forget. Courage and connection can exist in even the smallest forms. Finally, the child straightened, a satisfied smile lighting her face. "We're friends now, Max," she said softly, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. Max responded with a gentle wag of his tail and a slight nuzzle, confirming the bond. The K-9 officer watched, proud of the dog and inspired by the child's bravery. The courtroom, now fully aware of the significance of the moment, absorbed it silently. A 3-year-old had touched hearts, melted the formalities, and reminded everyone of the profound simplicity of trust and friendship. For the rest of the morning, the courtroom carried the invisible warmth of the encounter. Lawyers, clerks, and spectators exchanged glances, subtly acknowledging the extraordinary display they had witnessed. Even after proceedings continued, the memory lingered, a quiet hum of inspiration and joy. The child had spoken first, courageously, and Max had answered with gentle understanding. Together, they had created a moment that transcended law, procedure, and expectation, leaving everyone present forever changed. By the time the courtroom proceedings resumed, the memory of the child's gentle interaction with Max lingered like a soft echo, impossible to ignore. The 3-year-old, now seated back on her mother's lap, smiled quietly, her eyes still occasionally darting toward Max, who remained poised yet relaxed beside his officer. The bond formed in those few precious minutes seemed unshakable. Even as the formalities of the court took over, the warmth from the encounter radiated through the room, leaving a subtle, lasting imprint on everyone present. Outside the courtroom, word of the remarkable event began to spread. A clerk, touched by the scene, quietly shared the story with colleagues. "You won't believe what just happened in there," she said. Within hours, social media platforms and local news outlets picked up on the incident, fascinated by the unusual yet heartwarming encounter. Captured in hushed whispers, tiny videos, and first-hand accounts, the story of a 3-year-old addressing a police dog began to travel beyond the walls of the courtroom. The public, hungry for genuine stories of innocence and courage, responded immediately. The local news station arrived later that afternoon, camera crews in tow, interviewing witnesses and capturing reactions. It's not often that a courtroom becomes the setting for a story of pure human emotion. One reporter commented on camera, recounting how the tiny child had approached Max with such bravery. The footage of her soft-spoken words, her delicate gestures, and Max's gentle acknowledgement touched hearts across the viewing area. The story quickly became viral online, resonating with people of all ages who found inspiration in the courage of someone so small and the gentle wisdom of a trained police dog. Meanwhile, the courtroom itself had begun to feel the lingering impact of the morning's extraordinary encounter. Lawyers, once focused purely on legal proceedings, found themselves reflecting on the quiet yet powerful display of trust and empathy they had witnessed. Some had quietly remarked on how the child's bravery had softened the room, how Max's subtle responses had reminded them that courage and kindness could coexist. The judge, though returning to official duties, could not help but smile each time he recalled the sight of the tiny hand stroking the disciplined dog's head. The child's mother, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, struggled to explain the moment to reporters. "She's always been brave for her age," she said softly, "but I never expected her to create such a connection with Max. It's something I'll never forget." Her words, honest and heartfelt, mirrored the sentiments of those who had witnessed the encounter firsthand. Social media users commented endlessly, sharing the story across platforms, applauding the child's courage and praising Max's gentle, instinctive response. The story transcended local boundaries, resonating far beyond the small town where it had occurred. In schools and community centers, the story was shared as an example of courage and kindness. Teachers used the narrative to illustrate empathy, compassion, and the power of trust. Children, inspired by the bravery of someone their own age, or slightly older than a toddler, were motivated to approach challenges with honesty and openness. Adults, touched by the scene, were reminded that strength was not always measured by size or authority, but by the willingness to approach others with sincerity and courage. The media attention also highlighted the dedication of law enforcement and K-9 units, showcasing Max not just as a trained officer, but as a living reminder that patience, understanding, and empathy could be as powerful as skill or authority. Interviews with the K-9 officer revealed a mixture of pride and awe. "Max is trained for high-pressure situations," he explained. "But today, he demonstrated a level of gentleness and instinctive empathy that's truly remarkable." It reminds us that even highly trained professionals can learn something from the innocence and honesty of a child. The story quickly reached national attention. Online news articles, video clips, and eyewitness accounts were shared widely, earning thousands of likes, shares, and comments. People were captivated by the sheer simplicity and power of the moment. A child who had no understanding of the rules of court had nevertheless commanded the attention and respect of a professional K-9 officer and an entire courtroom full of adults. Max's calm response underscored the story's emotional resonance, proving that courage and trust could bridge worlds, species, and expectations. For the child, the attention was overwhelming yet unassuming. She had acted from instinct, driven by curiosity, bravery, and a genuine desire to befriend Max. She had no understanding of the viral story it would become. She only knew she had wanted to reach out, to connect, and to offer friendship. Her mother explained this to reporters with quiet pride. She didn't realize she was doing anything remarkable. She just wanted to be Max's friend. That's all. The purity of that intent made the story even more compelling to audiences everywhere. Community leaders praised the event as an example of innocence meeting responsibility, courage meeting discipline, and empathy meeting training. Local schools held discussions about the power of trust and kindness, using the story to encourage children to approach life's challenges with openness and honesty. Social media users shared their own experiences of unexpected friendships, drawing parallels between their lives and the simple yet profound connection between the child and Max. The story had transcended its setting, inspiring countless people to reevaluate the way they viewed courage, empathy, and friendship. Meanwhile, the courtroom itself retained a subtle but tangible transformation. Those who had witnessed the moment carried it with them, a quiet sense of awe and inspiration that lingered long after the official proceedings concluded. The judge, clerks, lawyers, and spectators left the courtroom that day carrying the memory of a tiny voice that had touched the heart of a trained, powerful K-9 officer. The child's courage and Max's gentle response had created a narrative that defied expectation, leaving everyone with a renewed appreciation for the simple, profound acts of bravery and trust that define humanity. Even in the days that followed, the story continued to ripple through the community. Children who had seen clips online spoke excitedly at school about the 3-year-old and her dog friend. Adults who had read news articles reflected on their own experiences, sometimes recalling moments when trust and empathy had bridged gaps in unexpected ways. The narrative had become a shared lesson, reminding people of all ages that courage isn't always loud, and connection isn't always conventional. It can manifest in the tiniest gestures, the simplest words, and the most innocent of hearts. The viral story also drew attention to the K-9 unit and their critical work in the community. Max, now recognized not just as a trained officer but as a gentle, intuitive partner, became a symbol of patience, understanding, and the quiet strength of empathy. Police departments highlighted the story as a teaching moment, showing that even the most disciplined and professional individuals, human or canine, could respond with kindness when approached with sincerity and courage. For the child, life returned to normal routines, but the courtroom encounter and its aftermath had subtly shaped her world. She had experienced the power of connection firsthand, realizing in her own way that trust, bravery, and friendship could overcome fear and expectation. Her mother watched with pride as her daughter's actions continued to inspire others, understanding that a single act of courage and sincerity could ripple far beyond its immediate context. And so, what began as a simple, intimate interaction in a small courtroom had grown into a story that reached thousands, teaching lessons about empathy, trust, and courage. The child and Max had shared a moment that defied expectation, proving that even the smallest voices can make the biggest impact, and that acts of kindness, no matter how small, have the power to resonate far beyond their origin. Within days, the story of the 3-year-old and Max, the police dog, had crossed state lines. What had begun as a quiet, intimate courtroom interaction now dominated social media feeds, local news broadcasts, and online discussion forums across the country. Video clips of the child gently speaking to Max, stroking his fur while he responded with subtle, instinctive gestures, had been viewed millions of times. Audiences were captivated not by controversy or drama, but by the simplicity, courage, and sincerity of a tiny child forging a bond with a disciplined, professional K-9 officer. National news programs featured interviews with witnesses, the K-9 officer, and the child's mother. One reporter remarked, "In a world often dominated by negativity, it's rare to see a story so pure and inspiring. A 3-year-old demonstrating courage and a trained police dog responding with patience and gentleness has captured hearts nationwide." Clips circulated across television, social media, and news websites, accompanied by headlines emphasizing bravery, trust, and the extraordinary connection between a toddler and a dog trained for the highest pressure situations. The child's mother, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, explained the event simply. Her daughter had approached Max out of curiosity and friendliness, unaware of the attention her courage would draw. "She didn't plan this," the mother said softly. "She just wanted to say hello and be Max's friend. That's all." Her words resonated with viewers across the country, who recognized the purity of intent behind the child's actions. It was the kind of story that reminded people of the power of innocence and the strength of human, or even interspecies, connection. Social media exploded with reactions. Thousands shared personal reflections, stories of courage, and images of children and pets forming their own bonds. The hashtag #MaxandMe trended for days, accompanied by heartfelt comments celebrating the bravery of the child and the gentle wisdom of the dog. Users shared videos of their own pets responding to children, comparisons to the courtroom scene, and expressions of admiration for the story's message. Courage is not measured by size, and friendship can exist between the most unlikely companions. News outlets interviewed the K-9 officer, who recounted the courtroom encounter with pride. "Max has always been highly trained," he said, "but what impressed me most was his instinctive patience and empathy. He responded to a tiny child with understanding, without a command, without hesitation. It reminded me that sometimes the simplest acts, like trust and kindness, can be the most profound. Viewers were fascinated by the behind-the-scenes explanation of the dog's behavior, combining professional training with an instinctive recognition of innocence and sincerity. Schools across the nation began to incorporate the story into lessons about courage, empathy, and friendship. Teachers read the narrative to children, emphasizing the bravery of the toddler and the gentle acknowledgement of Max. Students were encouraged to reflect on moments when trust, kindness, and courage had transformed interactions in their own lives. Across classrooms, the story inspired conversations about honesty, sincerity, and the power of small, courageous gestures. It had become more than a courtroom anecdote. It had become a teaching tool. Community centers and local organizations invited the child and her mother to speak about the event, where appropriate, celebrating acts of empathy and bravery. The toddler, though young, participated in the experience with her mother's guidance, recounting her encounter with Max and demonstrating the gentle way she had interacted with the dog. Audiences of all ages were touched, some moved to tears, others inspired to approach their own lives with courage and sincerity. The story had grown from a single courtroom moment into a nationwide conversation about connection, bravery, and trust. Veteran law enforcement officers and K-9 trainers weighed in on the story, praising the dog's instinctive behavior. They explained that trained dogs, especially those used in high-stress environments, are conditioned for vigilance, obedience, and protection. For a dog like Max to respond to a tiny child with patience, understanding, and gentleness was exceptional. Many officers shared similar experiences where children interacted with service animals, but few stories had captured the public imagination so profoundly. Max had become a symbol of the balance between discipline and empathy, training and instinct, duty and gentle understanding. The child's actions were also highlighted as a rare display of bravery and honesty. Psychologists and child development experts emphasize the courage it takes for a young child to approach an unfamiliar, large, and imposing animal without fear. This is a perfect example of how innocence can inspire confidence and trust, one expert commented. The child demonstrated not just bravery, but also empathy, recognizing the dog as a being capable of friendship and understanding. Adults often forget the power of such small, courageous acts. Across social media, the public shared reactions ranging from awe to inspiration. People posted photos of their children with pets, videos of moments when courage had unexpectedly emerged in tiny forms, and reflections on what it meant to approach life with sincerity and trust. Hashtags like courage in little forms, trust and bravery, and friendship without boundaries accompanied these posts. The story had struck a chord with audiences of all ages, cultures, and backgrounds, proving that moments of kindness and courage could resonate universally. Even the courtroom staff, who had initially experienced the encounter as part of their routine duties, now found themselves featured in interviews and articles. Clerks, reporters, and spectators shared how they had felt the courtroom's energy shift, how the tiny child's words and gestures had softened the formal atmosphere, and how Max's gentle responses had captivated everyone present. Many described feeling a sense of personal inspiration, renewed faith in human and canine connections, and a profound appreciation for courage and trust in its purest forms. The national media continued to follow the story for weeks. Morning shows, talk programs, and online news outlets featured discussions about bravery, empathy, and the power of trust. Experts in child development, law enforcement, and animal behavior all praised the moment for its emotional depth and broader implications. The 3-year-old, her mother, and Max were invited to participate in interviews, carefully guided to protect the child's innocence while sharing the extraordinary tale. Soon, public recognition arrived. Messages poured in from all corners of the country, praising the child for her bravery and Max for his calm, instinctive responses. People shared similar experiences, inspired by the story, while others reflected on moments when trust and courage had made a difference in their lives. Social media feeds overflowed with admiration, and local officials celebrated the event as a symbol of community values, empathy, bravery, and connection across differences. Even months later, the story remained a point of discussion, featured in articles about kindness, courage, and the unexpected lessons taught by children and animals alike. The courtroom encounter had evolved into a national symbol, demonstrating that even the smallest gestures could have a powerful, lasting impact. The child and Max had become more than participants in a single morning. They had become representatives of innocence, courage, and the enduring power of trust. And so, the story that began quietly in a small courtroom had grown to touch hearts nationwide. People were inspired to look at their own lives, their own relationships, and their own capacity for courage and empathy. A 3-year-old and a highly trained police dog had shown that friendship and bravery know no boundaries, that acts of kindness and trust resonate far beyond their immediate surroundings. The narrative had moved from a courtroom to living rooms, schools, and offices, and it continued to remind people everywhere of the beauty of courage, innocence, and connection. Weeks after the courtroom encounter, life gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Yet for those who had witnessed the extraordinary moment, nothing would ever be quite the same. The 3-year-old story continued to ripple through the community, the state, and even the nation. Max, the police dog, remained a symbol of patience, loyalty, and gentle understanding, and the tiny child who had fearlessly approached him became an unexpected ambassador for courage, empathy, and connection. The child's mother, still adjusting to the whirlwind of attention, reflected on how a simple act of friendship had created such a profound impact. She didn't set out to make headlines, she said. She just wanted to say hello to Max, and somehow in doing that she reminded everyone, adults, officers, and children alike, what it means to be brave, to trust, and to care. Her words resonated with many, reminding the public that extraordinary moments often come from the most ordinary intentions. At home, the child continued to speak fondly of Max, recounting the stories of their brief but meaningful interaction. She insisted on visiting the police station occasionally, eager to see her friend again. The K-9 officer, now more aware than ever of the dog's gentle nature, welcomed the visits carefully, ensuring the child's safety while allowing Max to interact in a familiar and affectionate way. The bond that had begun in the courtroom was now nurtured outside its walls, a rare friendship built on trust, understanding, and the pure innocence of a child. The community recognized the significance of the story. Local newspapers featured follow-up articles highlighting the enduring lessons of the encounter, celebrating both the child's courage and Max's gentle response. Schools included the story in lessons about empathy, bravery, and friendship, showing students that acts of kindness and trust can leave a lasting impression. The tale transcended the initial courtroom setting, becoming a teaching tool for children, educators, and even adults navigating the complexities of human interaction. Social media continued to share updates about the child and Max. Photographs of the child waving to Max at the police station went viral, and short video clips circulated showing Max responding patiently, calmly, and affectionately to her presence. Audiences around the country were delighted to see that the connection formed in that single morning had endured. People were inspired to reflect on their own relationships, acts of courage, and the importance of trust, even with those they might initially perceive as intimidating or different. Local authorities celebrated the story as an example of the positive impact of K-9 units beyond law enforcement duties. Max was praised not only for his service, but also for the emotional intelligence he demonstrated in interacting with a tiny, fearless child. Officers emphasized that such interactions reminded the public of the humanity inherent in policing, and that even highly trained service animals could demonstrate empathy, patience, and understanding. Max became, in many ways, a community hero as much as he was a trained officer. The child's bravery continued to inspire discussions about childhood courage and development. Experts highlighted the rarity of a child demonstrating such calm and confidence around a large, disciplined animal, noting that the experience would likely foster empathy, self-assurance, and compassion as she grew. Psychologists and educators used the story as an example of the profound impact early experiences of trust and connection can have on a child's development, emphasizing that courage comes in many forms, from standing up to peers to reaching out to a seemingly intimidating friend. The courtroom itself remained a site of fond recollection. Judges, clerks, lawyers, and spectators frequently shared the story with newcomers, recalling the subtle shift in energy, the hush that fell over the room, and the pure sincerity of a child who had reminded them of the human capacity for connection. Even long after the case had concluded, visitors who entered the courtroom would hear about the moment a 3-year-old approached a police dog and changed the mood of the room forever. It became more than a story. It became a local legend, retold for its warmth, courage, and enduring lesson in trust. As the months passed, the child continued to grow, visiting the police station regularly. Max, ever patient and gentle, remained her steadfast companion during these visits. Each interaction reinforced the bond first formed in the courtroom, allowing the child to witness firsthand the patience, empathy, and loyalty of her unlikely friend. She began to understand, in simple terms, that courage is not always about grand gestures or physical feats. It can be found in the small, everyday acts of reaching out, trusting, and showing kindness. The story even inspired charitable initiatives. Local animal shelters, schools, and children's programs leveraged the narrative to encourage empathy toward animals and respect for the work of service animals. Some community members organized Meet a K9 events for children, emphasizing the importance of trust, gentle handling, and understanding. The child and her mother participated occasionally, sharing her experiences in the courtroom and the lessons learned from Max. Children were captivated, learning that bravery and kindness could ripple through their own communities in meaningful ways. Media outlets continued to follow the story, occasionally providing updates about the child and Max. Audiences were delighted to see that the connection had endured, and the narrative continued to inspire. Social media users posted their own moments of bravery, trust, and friendship, creating a ripple effect that reached far beyond the small courtroom where the story began. In a world often dominated by negativity and conflict, the tale of a child and a police dog reminded people that even the simplest acts of empathy and courage could transform hearts. Eventually, the story became more than just a viral sensation. It became a symbol. Max and the child represented the potential for understanding, trust, and courage in everyday life. The courtroom moment was shared in schools, social programs, and parenting discussions as an illustration of the importance of teaching children about empathy, respect, and courage. Adults, too, reflected on the experience, recognizing that learning to trust and to approach life with sincerity and openness could yield powerful, positive results. In the quiet moments, the child would sit with Max at the station, gently stroking his fur, whispering little thoughts, and laughing softly as he responded in kind. These moments, private yet deeply meaningful, reinforced the lessons first learned in the courtroom. Courage is not always loud, kindness is not always visible, and the bonds formed through trust and sincerity are often the strongest of all. The two had formed a connection that transcended words, teaching everyone who watched that bravery and empathy are sometimes found in the simplest gestures. Years later, as stories were retold, the memory of that morning remained vivid. People recounted the sight of a tiny child speaking directly to a trained police dog, the hush that fell over the courtroom, and the way Max responded with patience, gentleness, and instinctive understanding. It was a story of courage, empathy, and connection that continued to resonate, inspiring generations of children and adults alike. The lesson was timeless. No matter how small, every act of trust and kindness has the power to change hearts, build bonds, and inspire communities. And so, the story of the 3-year-old and Max did not end with a single courtroom moment. It lived on in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it, in classrooms, in homes, on social media, and in the community that embraced it. A tiny child had approached a large, disciplined police dog, offering friendship and courage, and in return had received patience, understanding, and trust. Together, they had created a narrative of hope and inspiration that would be remembered, celebrated, and cherished for years to come. In the end, the story was simple yet profound. Courage and kindness can exist in the smallest of hearts, trust can be earned in moments of sincerity, and a bond formed through patience, empathy, and gentle understanding can ripple far beyond its origin. The courtroom may have returned to order, the media may have moved on to new stories, and life continued as usual. But for those who had witnessed it, and for the child and Max themselves, the bond and the lesson would endure forever.